conference keynote speaker, Ambassador Nabil Fahmy, the ambassador of the Arab Republic of Egypt to the United States. He has served in that capacity since 1999, if I'm correct, Mr. Ambassador, and is a distinguished career diplomat who has played an active role in the numerous attempts to bring peace to the Middle East, as well as in international and regional disarmament efforts. Ambassador Fahmy, who interestingly was born in New York and speaks English, French, and Arabic fluently, received his Bachelor of Science in Physics and Mathematics in 1974 and his Master of Arts in Management in 1976, both from the American University in Cairo. In prior career postings, he served as Egypt's ambassador to Japan, as well as a political advisor to the Egyptian foreign minister. He has also been a senior disarmament official within the Department of the International Organizations in Egypt's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and a member of the Egyptian Mission to the United Nations Disarmament and Political Affairs Division in Geneva and in New York. He has also served as advisor in the cabinet of the Vice President of Egypt and as a member of the cabinet of the Secretary of the President for External Communications. Believe me, I have just scratched the surface of the credentials of this most distinguished diplomat. I could not be really more pleased that Ambassador Fahmy took time out of his very busy schedule to come back down here and again to give us, I think for the first time in our conference, an international perspective on so many of the issues that we have discussed in our panels and that Jim Pavitt talked about in the lunch today. So without further ado, let me introduce to you Ambassador Nabil Fahmy.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that very flattering introduction, much of which I don't deserve, frankly. When I listen to my CV being read, parts of it, actually look at it, my reaction is normally the opposite of what you said. I wonder how I survived all that. and whether I'm going to be held responsible for what we haven't done. But anyway, what I've done, I'm proud of, and at least I've made an effort in trying to make a contribution, and I have to say I'm also proud of my own country's contribution to many of those issues. But I'm not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until we can conclude some of those important issues, particularly peace in the Middle East. I couldn't be more honored to be invited back here again. Your center and Duke University do tremendous work, and it has a very high reputation. To be invited once can be luck or a mistake. To be invited again means I didn't fall on my face the first time. So I'm truly honored, personally honored to be asked to come back. Now, of course, as much as it is an honor, it was in many ways a bittersweet honor, because I've been asked to come 3 years later to talk about the same subject. In other words, the issue of terrorism still is with us, and it's an issue which still is paramount among all of our communities, not only in America, but everybody else. And therefore, there's work to be done that we need to focus on and to move on, because if we don't deal with this issue, it truly will be a problem for all of us in many years to come. I have a horrible habit of writing speeches over and over again and then rewriting them an hour before I come, and I can never read my handwriting, and that's probably the problem. I'm going to start off by doing something typical Middle Eastern, by actually telling you my conclusions first. Normally in the Middle East we do that. Occasionally we don't get into why, and we stop with the pronounced conclusions. So that we'll see how it develops. I've also, to be fair to my Middle Eastern origin, I've also been in Washington for 5 years. And in Washington you learn to make your case as early as you can, as soon as you can, when you've been given the opportunity. Everybody and his neighbor is an advocate in the Beltway. So I've learned to sort of place my position out there, and then if there are still people around the room, I'll explain it. So it's both Middle Eastern and both also my Washington practice. The conclusion part. The question I am asked more often than anything else about this particular issue, the issue of terrorism. Are we safer today than we were at 9/11 or before 9/11? My answer is always rephrase the question. I actually read it wrong. The question always, when asked from an American, is America safer today? And I always rephrase the question, because you should actually say, are we safer today? Or who, if you want, do you actually mean by we? It's not America. It's not an American problem. It's the world. It cannot be dealt with as an American problem. And if you want to analyze it only by way of America, you're looking at a time frame. Is America more secure today in this particular time frame, and in a particular circumstance? So my first question is, America has to understand it is a global power. And you cannot define yourself as being America in the continent, but it has to be America and American interests. And American interests are global. And if you define it that way, then frankly, there are many, many more questions that one has to address before concluding if we're safer or not. The other point I'd like to make, and I think that is very important here, this is not a problem that you can solve by yourselves. And consequently, it's not a problem which can be looked at only from the perspective of one nation, or from the perspective of the politics of one nation alone. It's going to be a very complex problem that will actually involve responding to all of much of the politics of many countries around the world, if we really want to respond to the problem and resolve it. If you accept my global context as being the way to respond to this problem, a global context that is based on a belief that we are all interdependent, then, frankly, I can start answering the question for you. I personally think that America in the continent is safer today than it was post 9/11. There's more focus on the issue of terrorism. There's more international cooperation on the issue of terrorism. People are more aware of the issue of terrorism here in America. I also think you're safer, and we are safer as well, globally, because America took an assertive posture in dealing with the policing aspect of terrorism post 9/11. Without America's ability to use force, to move the military, to address security problems in different parts of the world, we would not have succeeded in applying the brakes, if you want, applying a cap, making it more difficult for terrorists to act around the world. So I think we are, in that sense, we are safer in that sense. But it's important here to take into account what we are actually addressing with what we've done so far. That will help you define what I mean, or understand what I mean by we're safer now, but also what needs to be done in the future. Policing methods ultimately are targeting the ideologues,
the masterminds of terrorism. You're not targeting the foot soldiers, the community support or apathy towards combating the scourge of terrorism. But it's, can we keep bin Laden out? Can we keep Ayman Zawahiri out? The main operatives, all the policing activities are essentially focused on operatives. And even if you revert back to many statements made by the administration, which I agree with up to a point, that with the number of high-level Al-Qaeda officials that have been arrested, without a doubt, the ability for them to maneuver and coordinate their activities as Al-Qaeda has been reduced. Now, I'm not ready to go as far as saying we've reached the end of the road here, but I accept the point, and I think they're right in saying that what has happened so far in terms of policing has made us safer than had we not responded, and I underline we, you led it, but if we didn't work together, it wouldn't have worked. But there's another element before I can give you an answer on whether we are safer or not. And whether you are safer or not, because I do not look as America simply within your own borders. In dealing with the terrorism issue, almost equal weight has to be on the ideologues on the one hand, and on the other hand on the foot soldiers, those that they recruit, the communities from which they recruit, the communities that will stand back and say, I'm not part of this battle, the government and the criminals are all the same, or that may or may not give safe haven. And frankly, dealing with these communities is not an issue of policing. It simply isn't. It is not simply an issue of can they get a visa or can they go from one area to the other. If you take the 9/11 tragedy as the example, the people who attacked America in 9/11 were Middle Easterners, trained in Afghanistan, networking in Europe, and attacking you here in America. It's important to think about that because it shows you that there are many, many dimensions involved here, and that to get the world community to work together, which is my basic premise for success, you will have to deal with Afghani politics, European politics, Middle Eastern politics, and your own politics, which isn't that easy, by the way. But so it's not all going to be something which we can actually calculate and determine. A lot of this is, frankly, our intangibles. But I always quote, since I've heard this comment, I keep quoting it over and over again, and I actually should phone him and ask him about whether I can do this or not. Secretary Baker, in a speech about 6 months ago, explaining his experiences in diplomacy and negotiations, one of the salient points he made was you have to understand the other side's politics. If you want a deal, if you want simply to explain your position, you can say whatever you want. But if you actually want an agreement rather than a disagreement, you have to understand the other side's politics. You don't have to agree with it, but you have to make it useful for the other side. And in dealing with, what I mean by this is, if I am asked today to tell you we're safer in the non-policing aspect of the problem, are people today more responsive, communities, to working with governments against terrorism? I frankly would say I'm not sure. They are when they're part of the establishment, but I'm not sure they're energized enough globally. If I take America, and I do, as being the most important, strongest global power in the world, and I underline global rather than superpower, then anti-Americanism, the rise of anti-Americanism globally, it has a negative effect on our ability to deal with terrorism. Because terrorism today, regrettably, is perceived as being terrorism against America or the American war against terrorists, rather than terrorism against the world and the world's war against terrorism. So the rise of anti-Americanism feeds into the political parameters that govern the ability of governments and communities to respond in something that appears to be supporting America. And the only way to change that is to actually respond to the problems of these communities. So whether we're talking about Kashmir, the Middle East peace process, poverty, liberalization and reform, Iraq, all of those issues will factor in to the success or failure of the war against terrorism. Now, I've often been criticized of trying to sort of add too much baggage to the problem. I'm honestly not trying to do that. I honestly do believe that because this is a different kind of war, a different kind of scourge, you cannot expect to say, no, only these are the issues that affect it, and I won't deal with these issues. Let's compartmentalize these and put them aside. Unless we are able to change the tide in communities that are not actively working against terrorists, be they against us in Egypt, and we had an act this evening, or against you, we will not succeed. And for ourselves in Egypt or you to be able to really gather people around you, you will have to deal with their issues. So when you have in the Middle East alone a coincidence of issues like generational transformation, 56% of Egyptian population is 25 years or younger. And since we're 1 out of every 4 Arabs, that means about 50% of the Arab world is 25 or younger, even in and around that. And they want change. And they see some opportunity but not enough. We need to create 700,000 new jobs a year off a GDP of $110 billion. That's the revenue of Walmart. And we have to do that. Now, if you add the gray economy, it's about 30% more. At the end of the day, this is a major challenge. We are succeeding. Over the last couple of months, there's been a very significant transformation. But at the end of the day, we won't succeed unless this is part of a regional transformation and the world at large. But the same, again, is in terms of America and the issue of terrorism. If people don't look at you as the country that leads the world, their politics leads the world fairly, including on their issues. The country that is interested in their issues, not only because America has been attacked, but because these are issues that need to be resolved in your national interest, because you are the only global power. And I keep saying global because global means you have global opportunities and global responsibilities. Super means it's a function of strength vis-a-vis somebody else, and it's not there anymore, by the way. And I frankly, if I can make one point, and then I will get back into the issue of terrorism. In my 5 years here in America, I've been astonished by the sophistication, the amount of information that your foreign policy community has, particularly in the Washington and the think tank area. It's an overwhelming amount of information. And I've been dismayed by the absence of a foreign policy constituency in America. Foreign policy is not a political issue for the average American. Iraq, for you, is not a foreign policy issue. Terrorism is not a foreign policy issue. It only became an issue when you were attacked. And unless you have a foreign policy constituency, you will not truly understand what being global really means. And therefore, you will not take advantage of the opportunities that exist, nor will you share in the responsibility that you have to share as being the global power. Now, I say this as a friend, and in the introduction, I'm glad you mentioned I was born here. So if there's any country that I have an affinity to after Egypt, it's America. But you have to understand this. Your borders don't end or start with the waterways. It's a different concept out there now. Now, again, I said, I start with my conclusion. My first conclusion is policing, yes. Resolving the problem, no, we're far from it. That's the sum of everything I said in the last couple of minutes. But let me reflect a little bit on the different elements of the problem. The issue of terrorism. The world didn't start on 9/11, nor did terrorism. And the idea that terrorists are those who attacked you, or only those who attacked you, is an idea that you need to truly change in the mindset. And I say this, and it appears to be a bit crude and a bit blunt, but the reality is the same terrorists that attacked you attacked us. And we told the Western world years before, these are terrorists. I'll give you names and examples. Omar Abdurrahman, Sheikh Omar, the guy behind the first World Trade Center explosion. He applied for a visa at your embassy in Cairo. And Egyptian embassy officials, like me, told your embassy, the guy's a terrorist, by the way. It's not logical that you give him a visa. There's a court case against him. So, out of diplomatic politeness, or whatever one wants to call it, you didn't give him a visa in Cairo. You gave it to him in Sudan. The issue was, frankly, and let's speak frankly here, and I'll criticize even our own actions as well. And this is not a debate about America. The issue at the time, as long as it wasn't a threat to you, he wasn't a terrorist. He was somewhere between an oddball to a dissident to somebody who had a gripe with the Egyptian government, or vice versa. So this was not your battle. Therefore, he was not a risk. So you were not concerned. Ayman Zawahiri, another example. Ayman Zawahiri, we asked to have him extradited from Switzerland, Denmark, and the UK. After our courts had a verdict against him. In all cases, the answer was no. This was before 9/11. The answer was no because we have a death penalty, and Europe does not. I respect that. I personally do not really like the death penalty, but it's the law. And I have no problem with Europeans saying, well, because you have death penalty, we can't hand him over. But at least arrest him. Don't hand him over if you don't want to. But if he goes around freely, then the debate is not about the death penalty. It's about whether you consider him to be a criminal element or a dissident, a freedom fighter, and we can go on and talk about this. Suddenly, all of these people became terrorists. Now, if there's anything good about this, is that people finally realize that terrorism is a crime we have to deal with on a global level. Because if I give you our experience very, very quickly, when we faced the terrorist problem, our first response was denial. We said we didn't have a problem. And then it occurred, and it reoccurred, and it reoccurred. And ultimately, there was a point where denial wasn't going to help. So we started to look at the different elements of the problem. And we applied a two-tier approach to dealing with the problem. One, people like Ayman Zawahiri would have to be dealt with by the policing process. But then they were the minority. The larger numbers were the foot soldiers. And whether we liked it or not, these were Egyptians. They weren't coming from another Middle Eastern country. These were our own nationals. So there must be something wrong in our own system that we were not responding to that led to this extent of frustration. And the answer, frankly, was in analyzing where were they getting these people, where were they getting safe haven. It was the southern part of Egypt, which was much, much poorer than the rest of Egypt. So the main reason for the society not responding to terrorism aggressively, and for some elements of our society, I don't want to say supporting terrorism, but in a way, well, some of them even supporting terrorism, was that we were not fulfilling our socio-economic responsibility vis-a-vis our own people, in that area in particular. It's not about who's right and who's wrong. It's about there's a problem there and you have to respond to it. And we consequently put in a tremendous amount of money into southern Egypt, provided tremendous incentive for investment into southern Egypt. And slowly you had job creation and people started to find a different way of life. And it dried up the resource where foreign terrorists could find recruits inside, Egyptian terrorists who were at that point were outside of Egypt, could find recruits inside Egypt. Now, it's never going to be solved completely unless we close down the country completely and you have no freedom of movement. So you will have every now and then the possibility of some activity and some actions like this, because terrorism exists in all of our societies. I say openly and repeatedly, the people who killed Anwar Sadat were Egyptian terrorists. But the people who killed Ishaq Rabin were Israeli terrorists. They were not Palestinians. Badr Meinhof were neither Muslim nor Arab. Neither was the Red Brigade or the people behind the Red Sarum attacks. And by the way, just for those who always attribute this only to one issue, they all came from democratic countries. And Timothy McVeigh was American also. Every single one of these people presented legitimate and correct reasons for illegitimate acts. Every single one of them was against big government. In their own way, they were all against big government, including Timothy McVeigh. Take Ayman bin Laden and Ayman Zawahiri. If you take their list of reasons why they attacked you, American bases in Saudi Arabia, friendship with Saudi Arabia and Egypt, Palestinian issues, these are all legitimate issues in our own societies. They're not their issues. They're not the reason why they attacked you. But they take legitimate issues in our own societies, including some weaknesses in our own societies, and use them to justify, in talking to recruits and otherwise, why they do what they do. And that's why it's important for the response of the civilized society, civilized world, to be both sophisticated and very precise. Each and every one of us has to do what he has to do domestically to respond to his own domestic problems. And America, frankly, has to look at, well, why is it becoming the target? Not why can others change so that I don't become a target, but what can I do to ensure that there's no support in different communities around the world to target me. You will never convince bin Laden or Ayman Zawahiri, but you can definitely make a fundamental shift in the sentiment vis-a-vis America that would help create a strong center that would stand up and defend America, defend the Western society, defend Egypt for that matter, against terrorists who will come and argue, well, they're not fair between the Palestinians and Israelis. They may not be, but it doesn't give you a license to destroy America because of what you think is a policy issue. Or you may think that the Egyptian government is not liberal enough or is too liberal. And we've been attacked for both reasons, by the way. But it still doesn't give them a reason or legitimize that you can use force illegitimately and kill children and tourists, because either we're having peace with Israel and getting close to the West, or because we're not moving enough and we're not liberal enough. Now, which way do they want to have it here? So the issue is, they will always use these legitimate arguments. I have to take them away from these terrorists. And you can't, therefore, assume that you will deal with terrorism technically. But there's also something else. I think terrorists have become more global than civilized society. If you look at how terrorists have operated over the last 5 years, including 9/11, they've actually taken advantage of freedom of movement, free flow of information, of money, communications, civil liberties, different laws that we have in our societies, loopholes, imbalances between one society and the other, and used every single one of them to their advantage. While civilized society, America, Europe, Egypt, hasn't been able to find a compatible balance between what is consistent legally and politically in each of our societies, preserving our own national identity, but also making us more global and being able to work together so that these weak points and loopholes are not used. And I mentioned again just very briefly, and then I make a couple of closing comments and allow you to sort of pick on me for a while. When we faced terrorism before you did, we went around the world saying, well, these are Egyptians, so we carry part, if not most of the responsibility in having to deal with this. We put up all the security elements that we could to deal with this issue. But we studied the issue, and the money was coming in from abroad. One thing we don't have is a wealth of resources. So we would find $1 million transfers of money to a post office box of an NGO in the Sinai that doesn't have a program. And we'd ask our European friends, could you tell us where this money is coming from? And they legitimately and correctly said, no, we have privacy laws, therefore we can't tell you. And I respect that. That was their law. But even when we had court cases, even when you had court cases and evidence that there is something suspicious occurring here, they still couldn't look at the issue because they didn't think it was of concern to them. And we need to find a way to deal with these discrepancies. We cannot continue to allow terrorists to take advantage of these loopholes. Money laundering, the transfer of money, a lot of other issues. Our legal systems need to be we need to sit down, whether it's at an international conference within the context of the UN or whatever other mechanisms we can develop. We need to seriously have a debate about how does civilized society deal with the issue of terrorism as a global problem, not as a problem attacking one side or the other. How do we make the systems flexible enough to respect each and every one of our civil liberties, but also be able to respond to serious, credible questions about activities that don't seem consistent with normal state of affairs. Now, there's always the question of how do we define terrorism? I don't know of a clear definition which would provide for an international consensus. And I say this even though the gray area about who's a terrorist and who's a freedom fighter is actually much smaller than many like to assume. I don't know of anybody in any country that I'm aware of who considers bin Laden to be a freedom fighter. We can argue whether what's happening in Kashmir, what's happening in Palestine or in the Israeli-occupied territories, there's a debate there. Who's a freedom fighter and who's not? But frankly, in most of the terrorism issues, there's no question about who's a freedom fighter and who is a terrorist. But politically, I just don't see us reaching a clear definition on this. What we need to do is basically two things. One, put together modalities so that the international community actually works together quickly and consistently on cases where we agree. Because even in those cases, there are a lot of weak points. And secondly, frankly, we need to make this war against terrorism not America's war. America deserves credit for bringing together the international community to work against this problem more than any other country could do before. And it deserves credit for that, and you should be proud of that. But it is not your war. If you look at it as your war, you will not be seeing the danger that will emanate years from now. You are the global country, as I said. You were attacked in New York and in Virginia. But you were also attacked in Yemen. We were attacked in Cairo, in Luxor, and in Islamabad. Our embassy was demolished in Islamabad. I can't ignore the Kashmir problem. We stood with you trying to push the Soviets out of Afghanistan, and we succeeded. One of the tools which people weren't careful about was promoting an ideological, religious-based opposition and the consequences of that. So we need to have a longer perspective of what we do, and we need to make this a global issue. And finally, I want to close by again reiterating for my American friends and colleagues, even if you want to look at your concerns first, if you don't want to worry about significant terrorism a decade from now, at least terrorism coming from the Middle East or the greater Middle East as you define it now, and the Muslim world. You have to be more aggressive in pursuing peace in the Arab-Israeli conflict. You have to continue to work, and I say continue because I see some evolution here, to work towards ensuring that Iraq is a unified country for all Iraqis, not a splintered country in three pieces. And we ultimately will have to work on some of the other regional problems. There is no major global threat that is equivalent to America, but it's much more difficult for you to deal with sub-regional and regional issues because you don't have a political constituency in America to deal with foreign policy. We can't risk you making that mistake. If you make that mistake, we will pay the price for it as much as you will, if not more. And I truly urge you to understand the context, the global context of the war against terrorism. And let me close by saying I want to also take this occasion to commit that as you do, you will find a lot more receptivity globally for this war. Thank you very much. Sure.
The ambassador said he'll entertain some questions, so we'll take them now. Luke?
2 points. You said that 9/11 was justified by bin Laden and others by the Palestinian issue and by U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia, but I think you said those were not the real, it was not the real reason. I'd be interested to know what you think is the real reason. Secondly, on the issue you raised about extradition and European countries saying that they didn't have a death penalty, was there any opportunity for you to say that we understand that, but we enter an agreement that if you return the person, there will be no death penalty?
On both questions, bin Laden gave a very long list of problems in the Middle East as to why they did what they did. That's for PR purposes, for the community. Bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, the Egyptian Islamic Jihad and other groups basically want to change their own societies in a manner that is consistent with the way they think, with an absolute way of thinking that it's either their way or it doesn't work. It's the majority or the ruling class and nobody else counts. And in spite of everything that is perceived about the Middle East, the center, while it is weaker than it used to be, still is larger than the fringes in any of the Arab or Muslim countries. And they could not, consequently, bin Laden or Zawahiri, succeed in their objectives going through the processes back home within the legal context of things. Given a vote or without a vote, they wouldn't have found the majority to support these policies. Now, if you believe that you're right and that the use of force is justified irrespective of everything else, and you're incapable of doing it yourselves, frankly, what I think they're trying to do is change the systems in the Middle East by provoking a conflict between the Middle East and the West. Because they couldn't do it, they're trying to provoke a larger issue. Now, the answer to that should be, let's solve the problems that exist in the Middle East, be they internal or regional, but don't do that as a response to bin Laden. Do that as a response to moving on in the future. So I actually think he's trying to use the weaknesses in human nature to achieve the purposes that he couldn't do or they couldn't do themselves. But let me also add, there will always be terrorists. Even if we all do everything right, including my recipe, there will still be terrorists on the fringe of all of our societies. It's always been there. It should not, however, be a force that people are apathetic to. That's my only argument. The idea that we will get rid of all terrorism is naive. It's not going to happen. But we can definitely make it a fringe element again if you develop the different elements. The other question was, I'm sorry?
Extradition, Europe.
The answer is yes and no. What we offered them was, while we had court sentences against these people, anybody who is sentenced to death cannot actually be executed except after having a court trial again in his presence to make his defense all over again. Now that's the kind of offer we made to them, and it was not enough. I'm not aware that we offered them guarantees that they would not be executed, and it may have been done. I doubt it though, but there's probably a legal reason why not. But you know, we didn't even want them. Just arrest them. You don't think that death penalty is right? Fine, but at least accept that they are terrorists. That was our complaint, not that they didn't hand them over, but they only became terrorists when they attacked them. Now that's not a definition of terrorism for anybody. The debate is not about who they attack. It's about whether they attack combatants or non-combatants. But if you want to get a definition of terrorism that is, it's a terrorist problem if it attacks America, you're going to lose me. Because politically, I can't defend that if I don't see the support when I face the problem.
Another question. All right, Jackie.
Ambassador, you mentioned that before 9/11 happened, that Egypt had warned the United States about certain people that you believe to be terrorists, and in fact they didn't get their visa in Egypt, Cairo, they said they got it in Sudan, Khartoum, and that type of thing. And then since 9/11, you seem to indicate that that had changed. And I'm just trying to get a sense of how much that has changed. In other words, your dealings with the administration, the Pentagon, state, everything else like that. Has there been, how can you characterize the change? Are they listening to Egypt more? Is there more of a collaborative effort? Can you just give us some sort of sense about your relationship since then, and are they listening to you more?
Sure. Well, first let me again reiterate, all of us almost made the same mistakes. All of us preferred to argue it was not our problem until we really got burnt by it. So I'm not saying only America responded this way. We did the same thing. We kept ignoring it until it really became a problem back home. What I said in terms of 9/11 was actually, doesn't relate to 9/11, it was simply before 9/11. Since then, yes, there has been a sea change. America has taken on the issue of terrorism, the policing element of terrorism, extremely seriously. And they have helped put together international cooperation on issues like money transfer. The conventions now and the regulations on money laundering are much clearer than they were in the past. The exchange of information between us and the Americans on issue of terrorism, especially relating to the Middle East, is very intensive and very cooperative. My only concern, not my only concern, but I mean my serious concern, is the non-policing element of terrorism, of combating terrorism. These are the seeds that will plant the terrorists of the future. They may attack you, they may attack us, they may attack a third party, but we need to deal with the issues that create the frustration for the future if we're going to bring it back to a fringe element. That's really where we are on this.
Mark.
Mr. Ambassador, following up on what you just said, you gave an example where the government of Egypt observed a problem in the southern part of the country, dealt with it in terms of the non-policing aspects of terrorism. There are going to be situations where the government of the state, which has a similar problem, won't necessarily be terribly interested in responding to it. Now, how can the United States deal with a situation like that when the United States identifies a problem of that sort, but for whatever reason, the government doesn't choose to address it?
I would argue, if you consider yourself to be a global power rather than a superpower, you would find what I'm going to suggest reasonably, feasible. Reasonable is maybe too much, feasible at least. The situation that you applied to Afghanistan, the Taliban, you threatened the Taliban to leave, to cease, do whatever they had to do, and they didn't. So you went to the UN. You got a resolution at the UN within days, if not hours. And then you took action militarily, and we all supported you, because you accepted that you needed to have international consensus behind this. You needed to have everybody supporting you on this issue. Frankly, if a country is clearly condoning terrorist activities, it can't simply be your judgment, but you have the moral authority and the political power to bring it out in the open, to provide an incentive for that country to act, and to create a disincentive through international activities that will ultimately increase the pressure in as much as you can. And the more you deal with the problems of the neighbors of that particular country, the more the pressure is applied to the country that is being the exception to the rule. Even the use of force. I'm not a pacifist, but I have strict beliefs in what are the limits of the use of force. As a regional country, a medium-sized country, either you're attacked or you go to the Security Council. It's as simple as that. Now, America is a global power that still believes it's a superpower. So, and in your mentality, and you may be right, because you're so strong and so and so you may be right in your own perspective, believes that, well, if I can't get it through the Security Council, I do it myself. We have to find a bridge here, because nobody can ignore America, but you can't solve micro or sub-regional problems by going to war all the time, alone. And the reason for that, frankly, is, again, you do not have a foreign policy constituency in America. So your own politicians will not be able to defend going into sub-regional issues if they're risky on a long-term basis. You have the power, of course, to do that. But it will not be politically feasible if you're not seriously threatened in the immediate term.
Let's take two more questions, Tim and then Frank. Tim?
Mr. Ambassador, I said a question for you about the question of Egypt's responsibility of other governments for whether terrorism as a problem results from repressive society, results from the fact that we are certainly, I think we're all on the same page that the people we're talking about are horrible people who will attack civilians. But is there any responsibility on the part of the Egyptian government for for not having liberalized its laws regarding elections, for having, for suspending civil liberties with emergency laws. I mean, do you ever speak to your government about issues, about those issues, about whether it's necessary to allow a space for younger Egyptians to express their views regarding change that might result in Mr. Mubarak being voted out of office, or other, other issues that might be difficult for you or other, other members of your government, but that might result ultimately in Egypt having a more free and open society?
The answer to that is no and yes. I don't think the Egyptian government is responsible for terrorism. If the answer is, if you're not a Western democracy, then terrorism emanates from your societies. Wasn't Germany a Western society when Baader-Meinhof happened? Wasn't Italy when the Red Brigade happened? Isn't Japan? It's not Western, but it's a democracy. When you had the Saddam attacks, Timothy McVeigh is an American terrorist. Everybody goes around saying Israel is the only democratic state in the Middle East. Ishaq Rabin's murderer was an Israeli terrorist. So the idea that, well, if it's not a democracy, or that the only reason for terrorism is the absence of democracy, frankly, is one I don't share. But the reason I said no and yes is, for us to be able to deal with the problems of our own society, including why some people supported terrorists, even in the southern part of Egypt, or to be able to continuously provide them job opportunities for the future, we do have to become more open, and we do have to become more liberal. So I do it for the solution, not for the responsibility. I am not responsible for terrorism, especially when I told you these were terrorists. And nobody would help us deal with them when you were not the target. But I am responsible for working for Egyptians, first of all, and for the world, on how to respond to the solution. And that's why, frankly, Mubarak suggested 3 weeks ago, I think it was, or a month ago, for the first time to have a direct election in Egypt for president. Direct election, competitive candidates, any party can nominate whoever they want, as they can. And we're still trying to put together the election law. And frankly, it's going to be a learning experience. Let's be very honest and candid about this. Your democracy was not born in one sort of burst of perfection. Dr. Rice often says that African Americans were 3/5 of a human being in America when you started. I lived in New York, and you still had segregation in the 60s. But you're a proud democracy, and you can be proud of your democracy because you continuously strive to make it better. You continuously challenge that you haven't made it good enough. What we're trying to do today is change our system so that the average Egyptian holds people like me more accountable on an immediate basis, not because it solves the problem of terrorism. It helps us on 10 different counts, including the issue of terrorism. But it's going to be a learning process. We're not at the beginning. People, particularly in America, always assume, well, they're just starting. When people say, well, Iraq was the example. If I was to take Iraq as the model, I'd have to go backwards. I've had a constitution for 70 years. Women have voted before Switzerland in Egypt in the 50s. And we have women parliamentarians for many, many years. But we don't have enough participation in the political process because people don't yet feel empowered by it. And we as a government have to respond to that. The president's suggestion is not the solution. It's the beginning of the transformation. The foundation is there. It's not the solution, though. What he's trying to do here is not prove that somebody else can be elected. What he's trying to prove is you can challenge authority today. Anybody can be president. And everybody has to be accountable directly by the people. What that will mean is not that Mubarak will be voted in or voted out. The strongest political party in Egypt will win this election, whoever the candidate is. And the strongest party today remains the majority party. The 16 other parties are still smaller in influence. But what it means is the Prime Minister is going to be held accountable on a much shorter leash by the people. The governor is going to be held accountable by the people. The mayor is going to be held accountable by the people. I think what the president did, and I say this openly as my opinion and as official policy, it's not the end of the road. We're still in the middle of this process. We have other things to do to be proud of our own democratic system. So we're not there yet, but we're going to work on this. But what he's done is basically tell people, challenge authority in a responsible manner. And you're going to have to learn that you're accountable to the people on a day-to-day basis. And the people will have to learn that at the end of the day, the majority opinion is the one that rules,